The Art of Yes. Interview with Jonathan Pitts. Okay. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Monica.
My today's guest is Jonathan Pitts from Chicago. Welcome in Warsaw, or back in Warsaw.
Well, thank you, Monica. It's nice to be back in Warsaw for my third or fourth time, but first time online instead of in person.
Yeah, what a pity, right?
The city is beautiful, so I always really enjoy being there every time I'm there.
I hope you will be back soon as this situation we have right now will be over. So I'm happy to see you. I'm happy to see you in good condition, and I'm happy to have this chance to talk to you. And
well, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, that's my pleasure. I would like to talk through your experience, career. What did you do, and your improv life. So I would like to start like really from the beginning, but. Mm-hmm. But before we start with improv life, I know that you're coming partly from the artistic family, and I would like you to mention about this part of your life when you got also probably influence of this artistic, I don't know, soul.
Well, two things. The main thing that you're referencing is my father was a professional ice skater slash entertainer with a company called Ice Capades. And he was with them for about 15 years. And his act was him ice skating with the chimpanzee. And my dad was a musical theater major who met my mom on the campuses of Northwestern University. My mom was a English lit major, and she loved writing and she loved, reading. And they got married, had me. And so the first couple of years of my life was my mom, my dad, a chimp named Spanky, and me, all traveling around America in a trailer home. And then my parents got divorced, and then I grew up with my mom in the suburbs of Chicago. And then, once a year I would see my dad because he'd moved to California, and he also would travel, most of the year with Ice Capades. But there was one summer where I went with my father and his chimpanzee. By the way, my dad had different chimps because they would reach a point where they would get too old, too strong, and too willful. So then he would have to replace them with the younger chimp. So he usually had one chimp that was working and then one chimp that was in preparation for taking over. So the first chimp was named Spanky. The second chimp was named Spanky Jr. After that, all the other chimps had other names, but performed under the name Spanky. So the last chimp that my dad had was a chimp named Marvin, but he performed as Spanky. And my dad and I went from California to St. Paul, Minnesota, by way of North Dakota, so that we could see some of the Dakota Badlands. And for those 3 or 4 days traveling across America, it was my dad, Marvin the chimp, and me. And so, when you grow up with a chimp for an older brother, you know that you are not meant for a normal mainstream life. And I used to see my dad on TV. I would see him because he would be part of the Ice Capades commercials. He would be on talk shows, both local and national, because it was him and a skating chimp. So, of course, they would want him to be on things. So, yeah, there was always an awareness that even though I didn't grow up with my dad and even though I didn't see him very much, that there were different lifestyles available and workable. So because he made pretty good money with Ice Capades. Because you imagine, there's not a lot of people who ice skate with the chimp, so that made him sort of unique. And then my mom, of course, being an English teacher with a love of books and a love of writing, that also influenced me as well. And she would often support me on the different things that I would explore. And if it didn't work out, she would say, well, now you know what you don't want to do. And as long as I was doing something, she was glad that I did. And then when I was in college, I discovered improvisation and started taking classes at the Second City way back before all of this improv exploded across Chicago and across the world. Back then, the Second City just had one theater, no training center, and they would have classes twice a week and only one class. And you would sign up if you were part of it. You'd be in the class for 13 weeks. You'd meet on Thursday for 2 hours and 4 hours on Saturday. So it was very different than how training centers work now. And I had a chance to join one of the classes, and I did. I went with a friend. He didn't like it, but I loved it. And then I returned the next time they had a class, and that was the first time I got up on stage. And I sucked. And, but I kept going back, and after about 4 classes, I got my first laugh, which was nice. And then I stayed with that class till the class ended. And I auditioned for Del Close's class, and I didn't get into it. So I put together a college group at Triton College, which is in the suburbs of Chicago. And we were an alternative liberal arts program in which we would study the same subject from multiple points of view. And we would have different sort of programs that we'd have to put together for ourselves for extra credit for the semester. So I put together an improv group, named it Intervisions Improvisation, and we performed at high schools around the area and ended up doing a final show in front of our classmates at Intervisions Improvisation. So there were like 120 people watching us that day, including some of the people that I met at Second City came down to see the show. The show went great, and these are all people that I taught how to play these games, people that I cast to be in it. I even took photographs of the individuals, put it up on stage, helped design the set for the show, and the show just went great. And I remember standing on stage afterwards as all this activities happening all around me, people celebrating, being happy, talking, chatting. And I remember just being on the stage going, I have found what I want to do for the rest of my life.
Wow.
And pretty much that's what's happened.
Wow. So, did you start like with long form at the beginning? How was the beginning,
Yeah, except for it wasn't called long form back then. Short form was not called short form. Short form was just games. You had improv games, or you had scenes, or you had the Herald. And that was about it. It's not, there might have been some other things that, what Keith Johnstone was doing, or some other things. But generally in Chicago at that time, you had open scenes, which was the most scary thing an improviser could do back then. Because back then at Second City, they would get suggestions for their improv set, go backstage, work out the beats of it, like here's the beginning, middle, and end. It would be like, hey, Monica, off the suggestion zoo, why don't we be 2 X's who run into each other at a zoo outside of the gorilla cage? Great. And what might be the end of it? Like, well, that's no banana. Well, and then you would write down on the list so that the stage manager would know Monica and Jonathan are going to go do this scene. And because we know the basic arc of it, we go out and improvise within it. Whereas the most scary thing that you could do at the time back then is just to go out in front of an audience and say, we're going to do a scene. And we get a suggestion and then go. And that's because the technology and understanding of how to do improvisational scene work has just grown so incredibly well from the contributions of people around the world and around Chicago and around the United States. Now having 2 people do a 2-person scene is not at all a scary thing. But back in the 80s, it sure was. And I was also then got my start doing the Herald, but it's not the Herald as people know it, because the Herald that people know it is from Del and Sharna's and Howard Johnson's book, Truth and Comedy. And the Herald that I learned is now referred to as the organic Herald. And Del later said that he looked at the Herald that was in the book as he referred to that as the training wheels Herald, because it's so structured, it gives people a way to learn how to do it. And that's why he called it the training wheels Herald. Whereas the Herald that I learned, being organic in nature, was more open and fluid, which also made it tougher to succeed in. But if you succeeded in it, you learned a ton from doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was learning about the organic Herald. That was what I was doing in my very first set of improv class. And we would also do games. And so I was learning the games as well. When I put together the group in college, I just did the games because I certainly didn't feel ready to even begin to teach the Herald as I was still learning it. But so, in those classes, maybe we'd do 30 minutes of games and then we would do 2.5 hours of the Herald.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I was learning back then when I first got started.
Wow. Very different. And yeah, learning in those days was very different, right? I always ask this, my interviewees who started so early, that comparing to what we learn now and how we learn now, it's really different. A part of that, we have access to many more teachers and it's much more known. Still, it's very difficult. It's very different.
Yeah, it is very different. And of course, I prefer the way that I came up and learned from because it was the way I learned from it. So I can't compare it to something else because I didn't have that experience. But I prefer, I kind of refer to the way I learned as like an apprenticeship. Not in the sense of like, oh, I'm going to get to socialize with this teacher and then become their friend, but more like I sort of feel like the path of becoming an artist, you start as an apprentice, then you become a journeyman, then you become a craftsman. And then if you succeed, you become like a master artist. And that has been like a way of learning that's existed with humans, all the way back to the Middle Ages as a learning process. And I felt like through what was available at the time, I was able to have that sort of an experience. Back then in Chicago, there might have been 3 to 5 people teaching and total. And when they were teaching, they weren't necessarily teaching at a theater, or if they were teaching at a theater, it was just one of the many classes offered. At Second City, they only had one class going on at a time, period, because there was no training center. And then some other people would teach at other theaters, so you could sign up for it for 8 weeks. So back then, you didn't have to go through a system to get to the top master teacher. If you like that teacher, you could study with them. And if you like them, you can take another 8 weeks with them. Like, I studied with a guy named Rob Riley at Victory Gardens Theater, and I probably studied with him 3 times, each time for 8 weeks. Unless the teacher says, no, I don't want to teach you, then you're out, you don't come back. But also then it was a way for me to study with as many people as I could. And for me, I ended up so loving improvisation and so loving what I was doing that I dropped out of college because I was a liberal arts major. So a liberal arts major is not going to get you a lot of jobs in the first place. So I dropped out of college so that I could study directly with people that were the pioneers of this art form. So I had a chance to study with Paul Sills and David Shepard, the 2 founders of the Compass, and Paul Sills, who co-created Second City. And I got to study with a guy named Don DePolo, who was like one of Second City's best performers. And I got to study with Michael Gelman, and I got to study with Bern and Joyce Piven, who created Piven Theater Workshop, which did Story Theater in Chicago. I got to study with Sheldon Pinkin, who was an early director at Second City and also was part of the Compass. And then so I had a chance to study just in Chicago with a lot of people, because over those 3 or 4 years, and when I said there was only 3 to 5 people teaching, that's when I started. But within 3 or 4 years, there were a lot more people teaching, or my awareness of them increased. It could be that I only knew that they might have been teaching when I first started, but I wasn't aware of it because it just started. But in those 4 years that I learned from everybody, I had a chance to study with over 15 people. And, some of those people, I'd be like, okay, I studied with them for a weekend. That was enough. But other people are like, oh, I really like what I'm learning from them. I want to go back as many times as I can. And again, with somebody like Don DePolo at Second City, you could keep signing up every 8 weeks if you want. Whereas with Del, his workshops at the time was if you auditioned and you got in, which I did not get in the first time, but I auditioned and got in the second time. His workshops ran for about 9 months to a year. And he would bring in 15 to 18 people, and you were the workshop group for that extended period of time. And Dell, who was being like a scientist, explorer, Picasso-like person focusing on different things, would have sort of a different theme that he was exploring during that time period of that workshop. And not just like 8 weeks, but for that whole 9 months to a year. And in my time, I was able to study with Dell 3 different times, each one for roughly a year. And each one had a very different focus or theme of what he was exploring. You know, when I would get to study with other people like Michael Gelman, again, you could sign up again. So in some ways, my learning was in my hands because I was choosing who to learn with and then whether or not to keep learning with them or not. But at the same time, if I studied with somebody, because I studied with Don DePolo for a year, that's what I mean. It was more like an apprenticeship but it was a choose your own adventure apprenticeship because I was studying with all these different people, but with whom I wanted to by paying to go to it. So it was like choose your own adventure apprenticeship, and I learned from all these people. I wasn't trying to become friends with them. I wasn't trying to, you know, I did socialize with some of them sometimes, but that was always nerve-wracking because, you know, I was so much a student. I didn't have anything else to say except talk about it. So, which is really, you know, when you're done with the class, it's not as fun to talk about as you're like, I'm out of it. But I learned a lot from those people, and by being able to work with them for a long period of time, that's why it again was like an apprenticeship because these were master artists, and I was able to get a greater understanding of what it was they were sharing or teaching or the philosophy about what they were doing, as opposed to what happens with training centers where you go through 3 to 5 levels just to get to the master artist, and then you only get a chance with them once unless they're directing something, and then after that 8 weeks you're done. And so for me, that worked better to be able to explore all those different ways with those different people, and also studying and learning from different people wasn't difficult for me in the sense of because I'd already had that liberal arts program where we would study the same subject from multiple points of view. Mm-hmm. Like we would, you know, look at the work of, like we would look at something like Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer and look at it from a literature viewpoint, humanities viewpoint, philosophy viewpoint, a psychology viewpoint, a sociology viewpoint, and it'd be the same subject, but it would rotate and how you would learn differently about that and really be able to focus on it, as well as the fusion that occurs from studying the same subject with multiple points of view. I had no idea at the time that training, that educational foundation, was setting me up for a life in theater. Because when you're in theater, you have to be able to do so many different things and look at either the subject of the play or the improvisation of the play or the teaching or directing of it from multiple points of view. So that was really great training. I called it like mental gymnastics. And then that set me up for being able to study with all these different improv teachers, all these different pioneers, and learn from them and be able to see where things connected and where they didn't connected and how it fused together. And also, you know, from my mom, who was paying for my education like she would have while I was in college, it was actually cheaper to send me to all these improv classes than it would have been to send me to college. So I got to have more fun, and I was saving her money, and I walked away with like a lifetime's worth of education. By the time I got done after 4 or 5 years, I really felt like I had a bachelor's in improvisation.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, how was it the auditioning to Del Close? What was it about? Like playing the scenes or acting, or what? How did it look like?
I don't remember the second audition because I got in. The first audition I remember because I had no idea what I was doing, and I had no idea who Del was. Just was that he was this guy. The person who'd been teaching before him was Del's stage manager, and Del had to go into rehab, and so Del was in rehab, and Del's stage manager took over those workshops, and those were the workshops that I was in. So when I heard about Del, because I wanted to keep taking Second City because I loved it, Del had us do a one-word story game called Story, Story, Die, where if you make a mistake, you have to kill yourself. And he did that as like a setup for other work later on, like scene work later on. I did the Story, Story, Die game. It might have been the first time I played it, but I didn't know. But I really didn't know what I was doing, except for just doing the best I could, which really was. So I made a mistake and I had to die. And I killed myself by heroin overdose, having no idea that Dell was a junkie and an addict in recovery. I had no idea. So I'm on stage killing myself, shooting up my arm, shaking, spasming, and dying. And I must have been protected by the fact that I was innocent to knowing who he was, because Dell said it was a good death. Still didn't take me into his workshop, but he said it was a good death. So, the second time I auditioned, it was more like starting off of the game. Actually, either the second or third time I auditioned, because every time I would study with Dell, you would have to audition to get into the workshop.
Okay.
I don't remember if it was the second one or the third one. I believe it was the second one, because Saturday Night Live had really become a thing at that point. And everyone then knew about Second City's connection to Saturday Night Live at that point. There were a ton of people at the audition. The first year I auditioned, there might have been 30 people. And whereas the second year, there was like 50 or 60 people in the room. And the thing I remember Dell saying, how many people are here to audition? Because I'm not going to do a Dell. How many people here are auditioning because they heard about us because of Saturday Night Live? And almost every hand went in the room. And he said, and how many people here want to be on Saturday Night Live? And about half the people in the room raised their hand. And he said, get the fuck out of my audition. And he laughed, and people laughed a little. He's like, I'm not fucking kidding. Get out. And that was it. That was the end of their audition. And the 10 or so, and that still left 30 people. And then we auditioned from there, because he wanted people that were interested in the art of it and the art form of it, not in the pathway to get to fame.
Yeah.
Now, what I did in that audition, I don't remember. It was just some sort of game, and then the scene, and I got accepted into it. So and it was actually good to learn for me that I failed the audition, because it was a challenge for me. Like, do I want to give up? I was doing this workshop for 7 or 8 weeks, and it came to an end. Do I want to stop doing this? I didn't get accepted by this guy. And my brain's like, no, I love it too much. I'm still going to keep doing it. And that's why I came up with the idea of creating my own college group. And that's why I sometimes think that disappointment or failure can become one of your best friends later on. And that's why sometimes I get a little concerned about us being too nice to students and cushioning too much of the blow, because they don't get to learn the self-reliance from it. Now, of course, I realize I sound like some craggy old man going, oh, kids, you need to suffer. And that's not what I'm really saying. But I know that for me, had I been accepted in that first audition, who knows if I would have kept going. But because it was something that I had to create for myself, like, because I wasn't allowed into that door, I learned the process of making my own door and then walking through it, which is taking the same lesson of yes and from the work and applying it elsewhere in life.
You're not the first person who said that in my interview about being too soft to students. So,
we sound like such a core of like all these boomer assholes who think it's World War II. And I don't necessarily feel like it always comes from a sense of embracing Viola Spolin, because Viola famously said, everyone can improvise. And I 100% agree with her. For me, the difference is, yes, everyone can improvise. Not everyone can improvise professionally. And I think it's great that people want to improvise and go play and do things. doesn't mean that people should be paying to see them. You and I could go bowling and we would have fun. Chances are nobody should pay to see us go bowling. We still would have fun, but if people paid to see us bowling, they'd be like, I will never watch bowling again. So years later, when I first started being a teacher at the Second City Training Center under Martin DeMott, the original artistic director, Martin made it really clear that we had two paths as teachers. Our job was, on the one hand, to recognize the people who had a chance to be able to become professionals or have a career out of this, and do what we can to support them and to prepare them for that industry move and being able to go in that direction, while recognizing maybe one or two or three people in a class have that and the rest won't. The other part of our other responsibility was to make people better humans. And that's very much the Viola Spolin side. You know, Del Close wasn't necessarily concerned about making us better humans. He was concerned about making better art. Martin knew that the artists were necessary, but he also wanted us to make better humans. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that makes a lot of sense to me. There's ways of being able to find that nice point between what we can do to use improv to make better humans and what we can do to help burgeoning artists become further along that path and go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. You read in my mind because I wanted to ask you about that.
Okay, please, yeah. Sorry if I sound like I'm lecturing. I feel like I am, so my apologies.
No, that's great, because I heard you saying that about these two ways of approach, and also people choose sometimes just they want to have fun and just to learn new skills, but not exactly they want to be a professional improvisers, comedians, however you can call it. And they have these different paths, and they learn and teach in different speed and different intensity and different way, and that's how it is.
And that's one of the reasons why when I teach internationally, one of my first questions of the group is, how long have you been doing improvisation? Because that gives me a better sense of how to work with them. Whereas if I'm working with a bunch of people that have been doing it for less than 6 months, I know to go in this direction and to help them have fun and to help them make discoveries about themselves and to help them become better humans, like being able to play and being able to listen, being able to contribute. Whereas if I'm working with a group of people and they're all like, we've been doing improv for 5 to 10 years, then I know that I'm going to be talking with them in a different way, in a different level, in a different process.
Yeah.
And if there's a mix, then I also then know that, because that helps too, sort of keep track of in my mind what this person's aiming to get out of it. And that's another question I'll ask too sometimes. If I'm not clear on where everybody is, I'll say, what are you hoping to get out of this workshop? Mm-hmm. Because because then if a bunch of people would say, I just want to have fun, I'm not going to push those people very much. And I'm going to give them stuff to have fun with. But if the people are like, I want to learn how to become blank, become better characters, how to have an emotional life while playing those things, those people I can help guide I can help guide and maybe push them a little bit, pushing them in a guiding way, like going up the mountain. Like those people I want to help bring up the mountain. The other people I just want to say, have a lovely campfire at the base of the mountain. It's beautiful here, isn't it?
That's really interesting, because I remember that for me, and I think for many people, being asked on the workshop how long you are doing improv, when you are in the first 1 to 3 years, and you're standing next to people who are like 5+ till 10, you feel like, oh my God, like what am I doing here? But also when I hear you now saying this, why you do it, I agree that it makes sense that you can do different approach, but it's still very stressful for students, especially those who's just starting, because they think that the lack of experience is just less skills.
Right, exactly. And I've had students say things like, I'm here because my therapist told me to be here, which is a really great thing to be aware of. Or somebody's like, I'm here so I can be a better salesperson, or I'm a doctor and I just want to have fun. And then, or I'm a doctor and I want to have a better bedside manner. Finding stuff out from people when everybody shares actually humanizes everybody. And, and then if just somebody says, I want to make a living in TV, that's why I'm here. Or I am a theater actor and I want to gain a skill. Once everybody shares in the room, some of that sense of like, oh, I'm with somebody who has all of this versus that lessens because everybody's heard each other as to what some of their goals are, what some of their desires are with that. And then also, because I'm still enough of a stolen Martin Lamont person that I believe that if everybody hears each other, they will treat each other better.
Mm-hmm.
Because, it's hard not to empathize with another person when you hear them speak their truth.
Absolutely.
And, getting them to speak their truth in a circle is probably the most scariest thing of all, but I did never want them to know that. So starting it up and getting that going, once they already do that, I already know I can work with them to some degree, depending upon how things go. Whereas,
actually, these were my last questions for you, but they became very first ones, and I'm happy about it. That you started to talk about it because you posted once the path of learning an art or craft, which for me is really connected to what you're saying, because when we start improv, and the first thing is unconscious incompetence. So everyone who starts any kind of art or craft, we usually, especially if we don't have a teacher or we just starting, we don't know what we are doing, and we're learning and we have fun with discovery. But as soon as we find how difficult it is, we start to be conscious of our incompetence and then start to grow. Do you remember your moment of this, recognition, if I'm still competent, incompetent, and unconsciously competent?
I say my first set of workshops that I took at Second City, I was definitely aware, I was definitely unconsciously incompetent. I mean, the fact that I'm doing a heroin overdose scene in front of Dell shows you that I have no idea. It was after that, when I didn't get into Dell's workshop and the workshop that I was in was over, that when I put together the college group, by having to teach them some of the same games, and at that point I probably knew 13 to 15 games total, and having to teach those games, I started moving from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. And I would also, there's somebody who I went to high school with that was really involved with improv, and so he and I would get together at a restaurant, and we would talk about the art form, and I would learn how much that I didn't know. It was great talking to him. His name is Jeremy Pollock. He's no longer alive, but he had a whole sort of handbook of his philosophy about improvisation, and we would sort of have almost like rabbi divinity students. We would get together and hang out and have coffee or tea and just talk about one section. So like going through the Talmud, just really talking about one section, what it meant. And that was when I really, really started learning. That's when the pieces of improvisation started coming into place. Because up until then, it felt like there was some sort of pattern there that I couldn't see, that it was like, there's something happening here invisibly, and I occasionally run into it, but I don't know what it is. Because also, yes and was not a phrase back then. That didn't happen until later when, Sharna took over I.O. and got that going, created yes and as a phrase. Prior to that, there was no yes and as a phrase. So you couldn't just say, it's all about yes and. So running into that sort of invisible wall, I knew there was something there, but I didn't know what it was. And then talking with Jeremy, like one of the things he was a big believer in is using white space, which is now referred to as silence creates tension, being able to use space on stage or space between speaking and what the value of that would be. And so that would be like one of the things that I would learn, and then I would use it the next time I would go into a rehearsal or a class. I would be like, I'm going to see how often I can use silence and what makes it work or not work. Mm-hmm. And so during that time period of hanging out with Jeremy and learning these different concepts, the invisible wall started becoming more visible. Mm-hmm. And being able to then take those concepts that I was familiar with and being able to apply them in a rehearsal or a workshop, it was like learning how to use a tool and start realizing, oh, if I use this tool this way, it can create this kind of an effect. But if I use it this way, it's not going to help. Mm-hmm. And then I started learning the differences of different tools. So that was a lot of what was going on when I was going from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. And even our early shows that we did with our college group were not that good because we didn't know what we were doing. I knew that we didn't know what we were doing, but it wasn't until that show in front of our peers that all of a sudden it clicked together. And that was probably the moment that I went from conscious incompetence to conscious competence. And from that point on, I just spent the rest of the time learning. Because to me, as a teacher, I think the hardest thing is to help get people ready to learn. Once people are ready and available to learn, it is easy to teach them. Until they're ready to learn, it's like hitting this wall. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the difference between unconscious incompetence and conscious competence is by the time they hit conscious competence, they're ready to learn. And probably even conscious incompetence, they're ready to learn. Mm-hmm. Because to me, once improvisers go, I've been doing improv for a year, and now I realize there's so much more to learn. That's when they really start learning. Yeah. And that's the point when they shift from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence and go, oh, there's so much more to go. And then that next journey takes them to conscious competence. Mm-hmm. So now that I've said it, I'd probably say that the whole 4 years that I was doing it and learning, the whole 4 or 5 years, I was at that point in the place between those second and third level.
Mm-hmm. So this comes to one of my favorite questions I ask. So what's your improv epiphany or epiphanies, or one of them which was the most important? Maybe this moment you mentioned, but maybe something else, which gave you this that's what we do, or that's my new discovery, and made you to push in right direction, or gave you this moment that you became better improviser?
There's certainly doing that show with my college peers in front of other college peers. That was one of those moments. There was a moment in Don DePolo's class because he used to give us homework, and which is amazing to think about. We would have a class on Thursday, give us homework, and then we would have to apply on Saturday the homework. He expected us to work with each other outside of it, and so we had homework to come up with a 2-person character scene based on a TV style, mm-hmm. and then improvise within that. And me and my friend John Evans, we improvised a 2-person scene based on a TV show called Hill Street Blues at the time. And because of that, Donnie said we could also show up, bring costumes, and put costumes on to help cement those characters. And that scene between John and I was so good that it really was the first time I began to see that improv doesn't just have to be funny. It can also be theatrical and have impact in a dramatic way or a theatrical way, as well as being funny. So that was like another one of those aha moments. And then there was a workshop that I took with Del, the third time I studied with Del. That's when he was focusing on doing invocations, mm-hmm. and exploring the invocational process and elements of witchcraft and trance work. He was a witch at that point, so he called it witchcraft. I refer to it more as like how to get into a trance state, and how to, which probably other people would say, even be in a comfortable trance state, say how to operate in the flow and how to be in the flow. So we did an invocation where we're invoking objects, and a friend of mine, Michael McCarthy, who's no longer alive, he invoked a Charlie Brown doll from his childhood. And in my turn, I got up and invoked a rusty axe, mm-hmm. something that was connected to a real life experience I had in California. And afterwards, when I was done, Del loved it. He was thrilled because not only was it dark, it skirted on the edge of horror. And that's when I also began to realize, oh, there's not just two things you can do. There's so much a wider range of this, and they're all workable. Like another moment that was a big breakthrough moment for me is in the early Improv Olympic days, back when David Shepard was in charge of it, because he'd done it in New York and done it in Toronto and then came to do it in Chicago. And he had hired Sharna Halpern and Mark Califan to be his assistant producers. We were doing shows, and David was the MC of those shows. I don't remember, but I was with this group called Stone Soup, and we did one of the 10 original Improv Olympic Games. There were 10 games back then. The Improv Olympic Games were 10 different games, and they all had sports-sounding names. And it was David Shepard who came up with the idea of calling them teams, not ensembles or groups. Because of the sports metaphor of Improv Olympic, David started calling them teams, which still exists now. He also, instead of having directors, called them coaches. That still exists now. And there were 10 original Improv Olympic Games, and they all had sports-sounding names, like the emotional hurdle, character relay, work put. Probably the most famous one, because it still exists now, is time jump. Because the time jump is sort of like the spine of the current peril that's in truth and comedy. Because you're doing, because you're doing two people with 3 different time periods of that. So I was doing a game called Work Put, and I was on stage with 2 other people, and we were in a factory, and the scene went really great. And it was so great afterwards, David Shepard ran up to me while the lights were out, high-fived, and gave me a quick embrace. That was another one of those moments that I went, oh, I'm really getting these different things and how they work. So, and then after 4 or 5 years, I moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico to be with a girlfriend and also set up an improv group because she said there was no improv group out there. I created a group called Phantasmagoria, and we had our first show in 6 months. And in 2.5 years, we did 250 shows. Wow. And it was during that time period, like I looked at those first 4 or 5 years as my bachelor's in improvisation. I looked at that time period in New Mexico like getting my master's in improv. It was also, I took classes at the University of New Mexico, and that's when I learned about directing and theater administration and working with my co-producer of the group. His wife was made her living in marketing and advertising, so that's when I learned about marketing and advertising. So, I often feel like I got all my training in Chicago, but I made my bones in New Mexico.
Interesting.
Because after all of that, because also in New Mexico, I performed in front of 750 people a couple of times, and successfully and just great, so all of those things kind of led to me feeling like I had like a master's in improv, and then I returned to Chicago, and that's when I started studying a lot with Martin Lamont and working with him, and that's when I started learning more about those other things. And then that led on to, I did take a break from improv. And I didn't do any improv for about 3 years, maybe longer. No, I didn't do any improv for about 10 years. I didn't do any theater for about 3 years. During that period, I stopped doing improv and I did original theater and scripted theater and performance art and devised work. And so I could learn about that side of things and have those experiences in those things. But it also started because I was in therapy at the time, and my therapist said to me, "Can you give up theater if it means being happy?" And that was a hell of a question. And so while I was doing that inner journey, I wasn't doing any theater. I wasn't doing any improv. I was just really working on myself and learning what I can from that. And then when I returned, I only pretty much focused on, after 10 years of only doing improv, I did 10 years only doing scripted work. It was interesting to return to performing because I had to create a new relationship for myself with the audience. Because part of what I learned in therapy and my own discovery was that I was seeking the audience to give me the approval that I was seeking from my dad. And so unconsciously, I was turning the audience into my approval seeking, and not just like approval seeking, but validation. Yeah, and the audience wasn't planning on that. They were there to see a show. They weren't buying a ticket to go, oh, good, tonight we get to look at Jonathan Fitz and approve him or not. We get to be his band replacement. What a lovely experience. So glad we're paying for this. So I was like, okay, if I'm no longer seeking that approval unconsciously or consciously from an audience, what is the process of performing and what is my relationship to an audience? And that, when I first started doing improv again, it was really nerve-wracking because I didn't know the answer. And it was hard enough getting up and improvising again after 10 years. It was also difficult because I knew that I couldn't do it the way I did it before and that I wanted to do it with a new lesson of what is my relationship with people in the room. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there are people watching this, if they watch it, just yelling, it's to entertain them. But I think the relationship of art and theater with an audience is more than just entertainment. I do think it's entertainment, but I think it's more than that. And sort of the answer that I came up with is that I look at the show as like mountain climbing. Except for I'm climbing a mountain in public. There are people that are watching me as I climb that mountain in public. But my main focus has to be on the mountain. Because if I don't, I will misstep and fall. Whereas they, watching me climb that mountain, will get whatever experience they get out of it. That's sort of their business, their job. And then my job is to connect with that mountain and climb that mountain so that they can go, yay, climb that mountain well. And after that, once I started learning that, I started having so much more confidence again about improvising again. And, now sometimes before I even do a show, like when I did the show with Dave Rosowski in Poland or in Krakow for the Improv Festival, and there were like 600 people there, I remember standing off to the side where the audience couldn't see me. And I looked at all of them and I went, I affirm all of you. You, the audience, I affirm you. You don't need to give me anything. I'm here to guide you up a mountain. I'm affirming you. Mm-hmm. And that gave me a completely different, that sort of mindset gives me a completely different relationship with the audience that feels more equitable and more like a good give and take.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Tell me, I want to go back still to this beginning just for a while, because you started with Del, and Del is so known and everyone talks about him, and especially his students. And even recently there was a talk on Facebook where people were talking about how was it to be his student. But I'm really interested also, you were a student of David Shepard for a while. How was it to study with him? Because I think he's a persona who is completely, forgotten or not mentioned enough. And all the inheritance of him went also to Ayo, to Sharna and Del, but he was also the beginning of it, right? So, okay, so let's come back to David. How was it to learn from him?
The first time I ever learned from him, he was teaching a workshop that involved multimedia. So we were performing in front of projected film strips behind us, and he also had somebody else operating different sound effects. And I improvised with a couple of people that became friends of mine later on, and it was so crazy and out there in the sense that it was not anything like normal improv. It was much more like performance art. Mm-hmm. And he was so passionate about it that it was really interesting to give it a shot. Like parts was like, I don't know if this works. But on the other hand, I don't know if it's okay if it doesn't work or does work. It's just so interesting and intriguing whether or not it works or not. And so that was the first time I got to work with him. And I was expecting a different person because of his reputation. And he was not the person that I expected because he was so passionate about what he did. So for those people that don't know, David Shepard was the co-founder along with Paul Sills of the Compass. The Compass started in 1955, July 5th, 1955. And it was the first ever modern improvisational theater company. And it was the first time that as a show, a group of people got up and said, good evening. Our entire show is going to be improvised. There might have been improvisational moments in shows or improvisational ad-lib scenes, but not an entire show. And I know that when Mozart was young, he did improvisational musical contests. So that existed, spontaneous composition. But in terms of a theater company getting up and improvising an entire show, as opposed to Commedia dell'arte, which had its own sort of inner arc and you would play the same characters, this was the first time. And also in that way that Bertolt Brecht, using that theater of alienation, tearing down the fourth wall and saying, "Good evening, audience. We see you, you see us. We're going to do this complete show for you, fully improvised." Mm-hmm. And that sort of direct address to the audience, which became popular with Bertolt Brecht. And because Brecht did influence Paul Sills and David Shepard. If anything, I'd almost say the Compass, rather than being influenced by Commedia dell'arte, that it was more like a combination of Viola Spolin's work and Bertolt Brecht. Paul Sills' mother was Viola Spolin, so that's why they knew so much about it. One of the original Compass players later told me that they told people that it was connected to Commedia dell'arte because they were all operating out of the campus of the University of Chicago, and that's so heavily academic, they needed to have an academic eye to it. So in order to have it be proven valid. And at that point, Bertolt Brecht was too much of a recent rebel to be considered academically sound. So them saying we're doing spontaneous Commedia dell'arte was their way of being able to get the academic approval on campus doing what they did. So that was the first ever modern improvisational theater show on July 5th, 1955. And different compasses ran throughout North America from 55 to 59. And David then moved back to New York. Paul got together with Bernie Sallant and Howard Hawk and opened up the Second City on December 16th, 1959, and Second City just went on its own way. Later, while in New York, David Shepard created Improv Olympic. And he had two sets of groups, and he developed those 10 different games. And each game was pretty good because if you learned how to master the game, you learned an element of improvisation that was now in your tool belt, or you learned how to do something well scenically. Mm-hmm. So even though they had games attached to it, because he knew from that Viola thing that people learn better by playing, which also goes back to Neva Boyd's original thinking at the Hull House, because Viola was Neva's protege, and then she used it with all the children that she taught at Hull House, because she was working with immigrants. So, I know I'm going all over the place with this, but I do like to say the origins of improvisation is because of a woman. So there's a definitive feminine touch to it. And also, social work is in the DNA of improvisation. Mm-hmm. That's why when Martin was telling us our job is to make people better humans, it made sense to me. It goes all the way back to when Viola was in charge of the theater department in the Hull House and was working with immigrant children and didn't have a lot of money for costumes or sets or royalties. She took Neva Boyd's idea of game theory and gameplay, and over that time period created 200 games, with the focus of all those games being transformation. Mm-hmm. And so Paul grew up with those games, and he created that and created Second City. And David Shepard, having learned from all of that, created those 10 games because he knew that those things worked. And those games are still pretty good games. And he had two sets of, he had a lot of different community people. So he would have in New York different types of communities playing together, like, all rabbis or all Jewish people. Or he had this whole sort of, because New York has such a mix of people, he would bring them together to do Improv Olympic. That went so well, he then went up to Toronto and created in Toronto the Improv Olympic, and it went well up there. And then eventually he left and then came down to Chicago. After he left it in Toronto, it evolved into what is now called the Canadian Improv Games. Mm-hmm. And that's for high school students, and it still exists now. And there are over 300 high school teams that compete every year in the Canadian Improv Games. And then, and so David came down to do it here in Chicago. He had the 10 games. He also had it in mind to have two tiers. One sort of like a community tier and one sort of a professional tier, for professional and amateur. And with the amateurs, he wanted everybody of a like-minded occupation or pursuit to become a team. And that's why the lawyers was called Court Gestures, a group of cops was called Magnum Farce, the rabbis was called God Squad. And so you had all of that in the amateur category. And then in the professional category, you had different people that had been training with different groups. So like Dell had a group, Don DePolo had a group, Vernon McKibben had a group, Sheldon McTinkin had a group. So each sort of person who had a lot of teaching in Chicago had their own offshoot that did that, and then we played together. And, you know, David was famous for being brilliant. David was famous for being mercurial and also having a quick trigger. And he would build something up and it would become successful, and then he would become unhappy with it and try to tear it down. So he was sort of famous for that. He was building something and then tearing it down. And he reached a point where he was tired of it in Chicago and left. And that's when Sharna took over Improv Olympic. I can't remember at the time whether or not Mark Halifan was still involved as the assistant producer and went forward with Sharna. I think he did, but eventually it was just Sharna. She was the one who had the passion to keep it going, and the drive and the intelligence and the hard work to keep it going. But David went back to New York. What nobody knew at the time, and only found out much later, was that David Shepard had profound bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. And that phrase wasn't even really used back then. So a lot of that desire to build something was coming when he was in his mania phase. And then whenever that would turn over and he'd be in his depressed phase, that's when he tears something apart. So by the time he as a human being finally learned about his bipolar disorder and started taking the chemicals that help balance him in the correct way, he burned bridges with so many people that nobody wanted to work with him. And everyone had kind of forgotten about him because they felt so burned by him. When I had that first workshop with the multimedia stuff, with the film projections and sound and all the stuff that was going on, was when he was in the better position of his bipolar disorder. And later on, when he found the right chemicals, he was able to get his life together and be able to sustain it. He met the love of his life, and they got married and were together until the day he died. And that was his wife, Nancy. So if there's reasons that people have forgotten about it, it probably had more to do with the bipolar disorder that was affecting his relationships with everybody.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't as clear. Like, everyone knew that Bell had addiction. You could see his heroin addiction. You could see his cocaine addiction. You could see his alcoholism. It was obvious. But mental health stuff, we didn't know back then. You know, unless somebody had like some sort of multi-personality, which is so rare, a lot of the things that we now understand about mental health, we have such a better understanding than we did back then. And, you know, mental health issues affects relationships and affects community, just like addiction affects relationships and affects community.
Yeah, and also probably now we talk about this more, and it's people are more open, and we can, as you said at the beginning, when we talk in the class, we can sometimes reveal something and say something or talk to teacher. It's more common now to talk about mental health than it was for sure 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it helps create more emotional health. You know, one of the phrases, being in recovery, because I grew up in an alcoholic home with my grandparents, I've been in recovery, going to 12-step meetings for families of alcoholics since I was like 28 years old. One of the phrases we have that I love is, "You're only as sick as your secret." Mm-hmm. And so to me, getting rid of some of that stuff is like you're spitting out your shame, you're spitting out the poison. So it has less of a chance to hurt you. And, you know, and I totally get that improv is not set up for therapy. And I totally get that it's not improv's job to make you be therapeutic in that way. But there are a lot of things you as an improviser know that being able to do improvisation helps you grow and helps you heal. And to be with a group of people, there's a lot of healing that occurs in it through play. It has to come through play, because otherwise it's just therapy. Yeah. But it's a lovely byproduct that comes out of that play. And I find the more that people can be true, and, you know, which is really definitely taking the truth and comedy aspect to heart, but you're able to be open and truthful, you are able to get past a lot of the fear and shame that holds you back from fully playing, and allows you to better be able to see the person you're playing with, really see them rather than some sort of projection from inside yourself, and have them really see you. You know, and I feel like in a long way, that's part of the reason why Viola came up with the phrase, see and be seen, hear and be heard. You know, it's fascinating that some of the things that she was saying in the 1940s and 1950s are still just as true, if not truer now, and that she was saying in a Zen-like way, stuff that has really deep truths to them. Because ultimately, we all want to be recognized. We all want to be seen. We all want to be acknowledged. We all want to have connection. And, you know, improvising is a great way to get to that. And then, if you get to go even past that and get to this other place where there's art and entertainment involved, whew, amazing. Yeah. I was saying that that's one of the main things that I teach. One of the main skills that I teach is listening. Because to me, if you listen, you pick up so much more. You know, and to me, listening is one of those skills that I've yet to see a form of improvisation, a style of improvisation, a philosophy of improvisation that does not need listening. So to me, listening is one of those skills that if you have, you can start operating in almost any style. To me, there's like 3 skills that you have to master of improvisation. And if you master them, then any sort of philosophy or form or format or process, you can have good skills within it. And listening to me is the top one, because we don't have a script. So all we have is each other. And, you know, just even the way you just nodded your head there and are now, that's information for me to take in as much as text.
Yeah. So what are the other 2?
Well, give and take, which is what we're doing right now. And yes, and of course.
How do you understand yes and? Because as you said, when you started to learn, there was no yes and idea, and now it is. And as we know, yes and is not to agree to everything always and anytime. It is a kind of idea which appears in some moments and it's important in some moments, but it's not a rule which works always.
Right. And actually, I feel like yes and is really good for the first 6 months that somebody's learning improv. Because they have a lifetime of socialization to overcome. But after 6 months, then you should start teaching them that yes and is not a fundamental automatic that you have to do every single time. Because sometimes to me, it's almost like yes and is like now the improv Taliban. It's a fundamentalist thing that forces people into things that they don't even really want to do. Like a scene that they don't want to be in, or a moment they don't want to be in, but they feel like they have to because they have to say yes and. Whereas you saying exactly what you were saying, being able to know that yes and is a different thing once you get to know it beyond the fundamental part of it. You get to realize that within yes and, you still get to have choices and make choices. And in fact, probably to me, that's one of the things that all these skills and all this learning comes from. It reaches a point to where then you can start making choices. And maybe those choices in the beginning are conscious or unconscious. But to me, at some point, with skill and gain, they become intuitive. And, you know, 2 people making intuitive choices leads to a lot of discovery and a lot of really amazing work.
So I will soon go to subject of the festival because I think it's such a big part of your life. But before that, the last, let's say, maybe, I don't know if last, but one of the last questions about teaching, learning. What's about follow the fear? Because we talked about it once, and you said you have your opinion on that. So let's talk about this.
It was Dell who created Follow the Fear. And sorry I interrupted your last couple words. Like in improvisation, that would have been a bad thing because I didn't wait for you to complete your sentence. So that shows that even as a long-time improviser, I still, as a human, make mistakes that I wouldn't make when I was improvising.
No problem.
Thank you. So Del came up with the phrase, follow the fear, and he came up with it in the 80s, or maybe even the early 90s, but I thought it was the 80s that he came up with it. And it made a lot of sense as a slogan and a phrase in the cultural context of its time. And there are certain phrases or slogans that exist really well in the culture of their time that don't have as much powerful meaning later on. Like in America, loose lips sink ships was very appropriate for World War II. It's not so appropriate now in America when there's a lot of things that are being done poorly that we need people to say what's going on because the administration, the current Trump administration is doing such bad things. We need people to tell us what's happening. So that phrase was very appropriate for the 1940s during World War II, not appropriate for America in 2020 rather. So I feel like where the culture was, the American culture was follow the fear was a way of throwing off the yoke of your societal oppression or repression, and that it was encouraging you to take risks or experiment on things that were, back then, because back then doing rock and roll was seen as rebellious. Now nobody sees rock and roll as rebellious anymore. So, and to do something that wasn't mainstream, you went from a beatnik and then the later generation became a hippie and the later generation became hipsters. So being separate, before you got to the hipsters, being not normal, not mainstream, you had to throw things off to go there. The phrase "follow your fear" really helped you overcome that because there was so much socialization of, if I do this, I might embarrass myself. If I do this, I look foolish or silly. If I do this, I fail. And and as such, it had a lot of meaning. Now, I think that there's an element of risk to using that phrase because now I think that because we have so many people who are improvising for the fun of it or to explore the hobby of it rather than trying to become TV people or theater people or actors, that I am concerned that when you use that phrase, you are unconsciously giving them an affirmation to engage in aberrant behavior with whoever they're improvising with that they would not normally do, rather than throwing off their yokes of inhibition or concerns with that. Because I want people to be able to remove their inhibition and be able to connect and be open. I don't want people doing something that is rude or offensive or invasive and have it be, well, you told me to follow my fear, and I would normally be afraid to say X, Y, or Z or do X, Y, or Z with somebody, but I did it now. And I think that's because we have so many civilians learning improvisation, being taught by people who may only be 5 years into the process, that they don't expect some of these things. Because I think, when I hear some of these stories about people being in scenes that they really didn't enjoy being in, where they felt offended or where they felt somebody invaded their personal boundaries and no one stepped up or said, hey, whoa, don't do that, because there is that sense of well, it's all improv, everything goes. And if you can't go with it, you're not a good improviser. So to me, follow the fear doesn't have the same cultural meaning in the 2020s, the 2010s, that it did at an earlier point. So I find it easier to say, follow the fun. Now, I also know that even saying something like that can be low because, one person's fun is another person's not fun. For some person, it can be really fun to play a broad character that's really big and does this. And I was like, wow, that's so not depth. There's no depth. Why I don't enjoy that? So, one person's fun is like exploring dramatic elements, and another person's fun is just being witty. So I recognize that even the word fun has to be unpacked to a certain degree so that each person can have their own understanding of what fun is. But usually when I side coach that to people, I'm talking to one person directly, and I'm not talking to the group. Because if I'm talking to the room saying, follow the fun, then there could be 8 or 10 different funs in there. Whereas if I'm working with somebody directly in a 2-person scene, I sort of know what's happening in the scene, and I sort of know where that moment is. And I might say, your big sister just said you're being really annoying. What is more fun for you? To apologize and say you were wrong and change your behavior, or to become super annoying? Because you've been given permission to go either way. What is more fun for you to play in this moment? And then that still keeps it specifically connected to a moment versus, hey, it's fun for me to say blank or do blank. So, and also that to me allows improvisers to get the choice. Because sometimes when you hear make the fun choice, sometimes to me inherent in that is still sort of a level of vanilla or mediumness. Because especially in America, a lot of American improv is just focused on fast and funny, especially in New York, Chicago, and LA. That's, a lot of improv is different in the rest of the country, but those 3 major places, a lot of the focus is on fast and funny. And so, when I was in Poland, which is where you are, part of what I really enjoyed seeing was how much the Polish improvisers really want it to be theatrical, really want the improvisation to have meaning, to have, some dramatic elements to it. And so for them, just doing something always light and surfacey is actually not fun. And so, and being able to have moments that are sincere or serious mixed with other moments, that's actually fun for the improvisers I've seen in Poland and in Europe. Whereas the sense of fun, maybe from a more big 3 perspective, big 3 being LA, New York, Chicago, is more just focused on surface and superficial and bits and games within it and just leaving it at that. So that's why I even recognize Make the Fun choice still has different unexposed meanings and values that may be unconscious even to the person saying it. But so I do use follow your fun, but I use it more in a way that's directly to a specific person rather than everything, because there are many different ways to have fun. I also find that if people are having fun, they will move past their fear faster than just focusing on their fear and doing something.
Yeah.
Like I have a fear of improvisational singing, which is funny because I did singing telegrams for 3 years in my life. But doing the singing telegrams, it was always the same song. Same one. I had 3 songs that I sang, and that was it. So it was easy to do. Improvisational singing is such a different skill set and such a different approach that I haven't had training in it. So getting up on stage and singing without training is just nerve-wracking to me because I don't know what I'm doing, except for I know I don't know what I'm doing. So when I do improvisational music on stage, I've slipped back into conscious incompetence. And you say follow your fear, go ahead and sing. All I'm aware of is my fear and that I'm consciously incompetent with singing. And so it's now like 2 or 3 obstacles to overcome versus there's no audience here. It's okay. Nothing to prove. Just sing. Then who gives a fuck? Have some fun. Give it a shot. Who cares? Then it removes a lot of those obstacles, and then fear doesn't even come into the equation. It's like as soon as you say to someone, don't look at that other person, you inevitably look at the other person. But to me, saying, follow your fear, you're like, what? I didn't know I had a fear. Wait, where's my, I have a fear now. So that's part of the reason why I would like to see that particular phrase retired. But then again, I am not the improv king or prime minister of the world. So there's no way to enforce that. And so for whoever's watching, if follow the fear works for you, mazel tov.
How does that work, the singing telegram?
Sorry, what was your question about the singing telegram?
How does it work? You were going to the people, ringing the bell and singing?
Oh, yes. Yes, we would be hired. I work for a company called Flim Flam Singing Telegram. Right? they hired me to do costume characters and strips. And the first couple strips I did, I was awful. I was so bad. And the second one I did, the women booed. And they were right. They were 100% right. They should have been booing. After it was done, I said, I'm sorry. And as such, Flim Flam Singing Telegram hired a dancer. So then he did all the strips, and I just did the character work. I'm like, I'm a theater person. I can do characters. I don't know how to do striptease. So from that point on, I just did characters. And sometimes the characters were dressed like a chef, or dressed like a Muppet, or the main character I did the most was a character called the Crazy Caveman, who had a foam core club, and I would wear fur with a loincloth and a cape, all looking like fur, and I would show up, and the way I had to play the character, because that's how they wanted me to play it, was I had to speak in bad English. So I would be like, me have birthday balloons for you. And so people would hire the company. Most times I would just go out in a tuxedo. So I would be in a tuxedo most times. So they would say, it's Monica's birthday. I'm Monica's father, and I want Monica to have a singing telegram. So they would give us the information as to where you would be, and then what time you'd be there, and then I would show up with balloons, and I would say, Monica, I have a singing telegram for you. I would have like a bouquet of balloons, dressed in a tuxedo, or I could dress as one of the characters. And then if there was a note to read from your father, I would read it, and then I would sing the song and sing Happy Birthday. We had a song that we sang for all the birthday ones, as well as the Happy Birthday one, and then I would give you the balloon. And then I would leave, and that would be the end of the birthday singing telegram.
But you are co-founder of the Chicago Improv Festival.
Improv Festival, yep.
How did it start? Where the idea comes from, and how was it?
So I co-founded the Chicago Improv Festival with a woman named Frances Callier, and she was involved with the co-producing of it for 3 years. And I co-produced it with those first 3 years. And then after that, I took it over. And for the next 7 years, I was both the producer and the artistic director of the festival. And then after year 10, I started bringing in other people to be the artistic director, but I maintained producing it. In the last couple of years, a lot of the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, I had other people come in to produce the festival, and I moved on to, and I became the executive producer, so that we would have artistic director, executive producer. But overall, I produced it for 20 years. And after 20 years, I was ready to be done after year 15. But then my mom had a massive stroke, and I'm an only child, so I had to rearrange things to take care of. I was going to move after year 15. I was going to move to San Francisco, Philadelphia, or Atlanta, one of the three. And then once my mom had that massive stroke, everything changed. And then for the next 2 years that she was alive, I was alternating my time between helping oversee her life and then running everything that I was running. And then after that, it took a couple years to rehab the home that she lived in. And then when it was sold, I was ready to be done again, but it was year 19. And I thought, if I quit after year 19, everyone's going to think something went wrong. Like, does he owe money to people? Why did he leave after year 19? So I knew I'd stick around to year 20 because it just sounds better to say, I'm leaving after year 20. 20 years, I'm done. And so that's what I did. Leaving on year 19 just sounds weird. Like, why 19? What's up? So to go back to the early days, I was already working on a lot of different festivals. I was working as a festival director or festival producer, or there were a lot of different festivals that I was working on, and they were going well, and I was learning a lot about theater and learning a lot about festivals from that. And I was working on a children's festival, not as a producer, but as a teacher. And that children's festival was being run by Frances Callier, who later went on to become the administrative head at the Second City Training Center, and then moved out to LA, where she's part of a successful radio duo called Frangel. And they perform all over the country and then also do radio and podcasts. But Frances was working on this children's festival, and I was teaching on it. And there was just one day when all of a sudden I realized, I was like, wait a minute, all these festivals that happen in Chicago, because Chicago is a big festival town, and there's never been an improv festival in Chicago, and we're the birthplace of modern improvisation, the birthplace in the Mecca. How come there's never been one? There ought to be an improv festival. So that was my idea. It's like, Chicago loves festivals. Chicago loves improv. There ought to be an improv festival. And I was like, but I don't want to do it alone. Who could I get to help me? So I asked Frances if she wanted to do it. And she was very excited because she said she's been wanting to do an improv festival for years, but nobody would ever work with her on it. Not because they didn't like her, just because they didn't want to do an improv festival. Everybody loves Frances, so it had nothing to do with her personality or skills, everything to do with nobody wanted to do an improv festival. Because also back then, the more you work on a festival, the less you work on actually doing improv.
Mm-hmm.
So Frances and I met for about 6 months, and we really planned out the festival for a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, even planned out what to do if it was a big economic failure, what to do if it was a big economic success, which one, how, if one of us leaves, how we leave. So we really planned out the festival for 1 year, 2 year, and 3 years. Because she was saying she thought she'd be involved for about 3 years. I said I thought I'd be involved for 6 or 7 years, never knowing it was going to be 20. And then we did the first year of the festival. We did it at the Annoyance Theater, at the old Annoyance Theater on Clark Street near Wrigley Field, because Mick and Mark Sutton and the people that worked there were fine with us being there for a week. We rented the venue from them with the promise that with the negotiation that they could have their 2 biggest selling shows still have their normal performances. Mm-hmm. So that, and then we would include them in those 2 shows in the festival, and then we paid for the rent for the week, and then I was able to convert the theater, because the way that theater was set up was good for about 200 people, and then had couches, and it felt like a clubhouse in the best way. But what I did was I brought in pipe and drape and redressed the theater and rented 300 seats and brought it in to make it look like a traditional proper theater. And the first year of the festival, Frances and I, our plan was to just build a small boat and see if it floats before we make it bigger. Let's do it one time and see what works and what doesn't work before we start changing it. So the first year we had about 30 groups total. We had 1 group from Canada, because I really wanted to have a group from another country, because I was a big believer in international theater and international arts. So even just having 1 group from Canada allowed us to say it was international. We had about 30 groups. We had 1 show specifically for children with disabilities that we did during the daytime, and these children who were disabled were bussed in to see the show. And we were able to do that because of the children's festival that Frances and I both worked on, so we had access to that. And so we had about 30 performances. Opening night was Upright Citizens Brigade, and this is when they just signed their TV show for HBO. And so they were the headliners for the opening night, and there was a group we had 2 other groups. One was like a genre group that was around in Chicago at the time, and then the other was a bunch of alumni of a group called Improv Institute. Because the Improv Institute was the first ever all improv theater in Chicago. It was prior to I.O., and it was like the first one that was the first all improv theater in Chicago. And so I wanted to honor them and what they did by having them perform on the opening night. Mm-hmm. So on opening night, we were able to have honoring of the past, and being able to showcase a different type of thing by having genre work, because there's not a lot of genre work in Chicago. There's more so now, but there really wasn't much then. And then have Right Citizens Brigade, which is definitely highlighting the future, because they were all going to become stars. And that was our opening night, and we had 325 people in the theater. So we had every seat filled, we sold out, and we had people standing. And with those 30 groups that we had that year, we had about 10 shows, and we had workshops happen. We had weekend workshops. That was Francis's idea. And we had Mark DeMott teach. We had Del Close teach. We had Michael Gelman teach. We had Mick Napier teach as a master teacher. I'm pretty sure we had Susan Messing teaching. And then somebody from Comedy Sports Talk. So we had representation from all the major theaters at the time and all the, modern major masters. And then that was the end of the first year. And it was not as big as the Austin Improv Festival, which was the biggest in America at the time. And we weren't trying to be the biggest. We wanted to see if it worked and if people would embrace it. The second year, we were back with the Annoyance. And we had more groups. It was also the second year we had a second venue that we then used IO as a second venue and had shows at Annoyance and at IO. Mm-hmm. Saturday night, our headliners were Second City Touring Company, IO's Roadshow, and Annoyance Theater's Screw Puppets. And it was the first time ever that Annoyance and IO and Second City were all on the same bill on the same night. Whereas the year before, it was the first time that they'd ever all been in the same venue, or the same festival, rather, in the same time. And then the second year, our opening night headliner was Colin Mockery, and from Whose Line Is It Anyway? And then I also had Comedy Sports and Baby Wants Candy. Because I knew at the time there was a lot of separation between short form and long form, and not just separation on the stage, but also on who did it. Back then, if you were improvising at one of those places, you rarely went and performed at the other place. You were sort of identified by who you were. I thought of it as like the 5 mafia families. And, and if you were part of that, if you were part of that family, you didn't go to the other family very often. And so to have long form, so I thought, okay, well, I know performers, once they all are performing together, they'll always want everyone to succeed. So I thought it would be a really good idea to take Comedy Sports, have them be the opening act, because I knew they'd kill. And then I thought it'd be great to have Baby Wants Candy, because they were a great musical group, and they were doing a musical Herald. And I thought it'd be great to have long form there and singing, and have that be the opening act and the middle act. And Colin Mockery was performing with 2 friends of his called The Devil's Advocate. And again, we sold out the Athenaeum there and had even more than like 325 people. And Comedy Sports killed. Baby Wants Candy killed. What was so exciting also was to see that backstage, all these people were talking to each other. And when they saw each other do great, they were supporting each other and celebrating each other. Mm-hmm. And then, watching all of this as the opening act, especially when Baby Wants Candy was killing with her song, Colin turned to me and said, I have to follow them. Wow. And I said, I'm nervous. And I was like, great. Year 2 opening night, we now have so much great improvisation from the Chicago groups that Colin Mockery is saying he's a little bit nervous about having to follow. He came out and did great, of course. Got a standing ovation from the audience. And it was just an amazing evening. And it was nice to be able to use the festival in that way to show that there's all these different styles and philosophies and approaches to improvisation. And to me, they all work. The better question is, are you good at what you do rather than what you do? And so it was nice to be able to show that at the festival. Third year of the festival, we moved over to the Athenaeum Theater and put it into a Broadway-size house. They have a theater with 935 seats. But it's lovely because it has a balcony and it has a main floor. You can fill up the main floor and never open the balcony. Mm-hmm. And if you're on the main floor, you don't see all the empty seats at the balcony. So our opening act, year 3, was Tina Fey and Rachel Dratch performing together. And it was called Dratch and Fey. And it was on a Tuesday night, and they sold over 500 seats. So the entire bottom was filled and the balcony was open. And I remember watching that show, and they had such a great show. And I felt like, aha, not only does this show that improv is an art form and that it is theater, that it can perform in a Broadway-sized house. And that was really exciting. And that was also the year that Seth Meyers was discovered by a casting agent from Saturday Night Live, when we had Avery Schreiber there performing and also teaching, and we had JTS Brown and people like Jason Sudeikis. There were so many people. Schadenfreude did their first show for us. There were so many people that later became famous in that year three. It's just sort of amazing. Jordan Peele, the Academy Award-winning director, performed that year with a two-person group called Two White Guys, and we also had Upright Citizens Brigade performing again. And Two White Guys, Jordan Peele, along with Becky Drysdale. Becky Drysdale is now the head writer for the Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show, and Jordan is now, the genius that he is in movies. So there were so many people in year three, and we also had a lot of other people from other countries. It was also like first year 1 and 2, we just had Canada. The year 3, we had the improv bandits from Auckland, New Zealand, and they killed. And it was also the first year we had a cage match, that was a CIF cage match, international cast. So we had a group from UCB, we had IO's group, we had a group from North Carolina, and we had the Improv Bandits. And the Improv Bandits won. They beat everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so there was like just this amazing thing happening in year 3. But by year 3 is when we really blew up. And, and there's probably people that I'm forgetting that were in year 3 that might feel hurt that if I don't remember them. But we had a lot of celebrities. We had a lot of celebrities who were celebrities at the time. We had a lot of improvisers who later became celebrities. But to me, the fact that they became celebrities isn't necessarily important, as it is what I'm trying to underscore is how talented they were and how skilled they were. And after that, year 3, we then became a thing. And I knew year 3 was going to be the make or break year. This is like a dating. Your third date, you're either going to start moving to becoming friends, or you're going to really start dating. Year 1 was just the first date. Does this give us a second date? Year 2 is like a callback date. Your second date, okay, will it lead to a third date? Your third date is the make or break. I knew going into it that year 3, we were either going to become a thing, or we were going to probably have to become a biannual festival. Mm-hmm. And seeing 500 people watching Gratch and Fay in the Athenaeum Theater on a Tuesday night, not a Friday or a Saturday, but a Tuesday, that's what convinced me that, yes, we will become a thing. And then up to 17 more years, and then after year 20, I stopped because I knew it was time to go. But I also thought that it was probably time for the festival to stop, because we had a mission statement for the festival, and we had fulfilled the mission. And and Chicago Improv Festival is run by Chicago Improv Productions, which is a not-for-profit arts organization. And one of the differences between a not-for-profit arts organization and a for-profit business is that with a not-for-profit organization, it is mission-centered and mission-stated, and it's about how well you're fulfilling the mission more than how much money you're making. Yeah. And so a lot of not-for-profits, once they fulfill the mission, they have to figure out, do we want to change the mission? Or do we want to stop and shut down because we've fulfilled the mission? Now, some not-for-profits are like, we got a good thing going, just let's keep going. And a lot of those will lose more and more energy and become sort of like zombie organizations. They're still doing the thing just because it's what they do, as opposed to, this is still fulfilling, the citizens of Illinois, is still fulfilling the artists that are involved. And if not, change it, or if not, shut it down. So I felt after 20 years, because many, many years ago, back when Francis and I first started the festival, there was still the huge argument as to whether or not improv was an art form, and whether or not it was a legitimate art form or legitimate theater form, and whether or not it was just, and whether or not people would ever pay to see it, versus, and pay good regular money to see it. And 20 years later, I felt like the work that we presented had way proved that it is an art form, that it is a legitimate theater form, and that people will pay real money to see the best and brightest, the finest, the funniest, and to see excellent work. And the way improv grew around Chicago, because back then there were like 4 or 5 theaters, and then by the time we stopped, there were like 20. And that was just in the city of Chicago, and there were 5 in the suburbs. And the way things grew throughout the whole United States, and the way things have grown around the entire world, having a centrally focused improv festival that sort of served as a national improv festival no longer needed to serve that. So for me, mission had been fulfilled. And so I thought that we should stop doing the festival, and not just because I was doing it. But the board of directors disagreed and came up with the idea of it being a biannual festival. And so 2 years later, when the time came to do it, I put together as good a team as I could, and unfortunately it fell apart and didn't happen. I felt that maybe if I got involved, I could have helped them or be some of the missing parts and fill in on that, but I didn't want to do that because I was done. And the people that I put together as a team were very talented. So to me, if they couldn't do it, then it naturally meant it shouldn't be done. And that's what I said to the board, and again said that I thought we should stop the festival, and they agreed with me. And that's when we announced we weren't going to do it anymore. And since then, before COVID, a lot of other festivals stopped producing, and a lot of other festivals moved to the every other year category. It's a lot of work to produce a festival. For me, it would take anywhere from 6 months to 8 months of work. And certainly doing all of that, it would be like 8 months of work, 1 week of doing it, and then like at least a month afterwards, wrapping everything up, finances and all that. So I also started creating the College Improv Tournament, which is just had its 13th year. And so that would happen after the festival is over. So there would be a point to where we also did a kids festival at the time. So doing all of that, I would only have about 2 months to myself, and easily maybe 3 months if it was a good year. I would have maybe a month to relax and recharge, maybe a month to 6 weeks to do my own private project. And then it was back into the swing of things again, getting up the next year. So for me, I felt like with those 20 years, I made my contribution. I'd given what I could, and I'd done my duty, and I carried that weight of what that was for those 20 years. So I served my time. And I knew that I made my contribution to Chicago, the United States, and to around the world. But I wanted to, much like a parent, be free because the kids are graduating and going to college, and be able to go and do other things. And that's when, after doing a podcast with Jimmy Carrane, talking about the same sort of thing, a guy named Pavel from Prague, Czech Republic, said that they were doing a festival there and wanted to know if I'd be willing to come out and teach and perform. And I was like, yes! And that led to me coming out to Europe for the first time. And that's also when I met you on my first trip to Europe. And it was when I was in Europe that I realized I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to go back to Chicago. I didn't want to go back to the States. I so loved what I was doing. In every city that I was in, there would be maybe the person who performed at the Chicago Improv Festival that knew me as a producer, but everyone else was meeting me as an artist. They were meeting me as an artist and a teacher and a performer. And so that I did all this producing was nice, but they were more interested in what I had to share as an artist with them. And that was life-changing for me. And as you know, I spent the next 2.25 years traveling around the world, and I taught and performed in 24 countries and 60 cities. And that was one of the joys of my life, to be able to do that. Then coronavirus hit, and now we're all doing it on Zoom.
Yeah.
And, until things can change. But, as soon as it changes, I want to get back out in the world because I really enjoy traveling around the world and working with international artists like you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's a really interesting story. I didn't know so many details. I got to know from Jill Bernard recently because I talked to her also, and the interview will be published in the next few days, so it's not released yet. She told me that your invitation to festival made her to do her solo show because she wanted to come with a friend, and you invited her solo. So
I didn't know that. I know I invited her solo. I didn't know that that's why she created her solo show. That's wonderful. Because to me, like what really good festivals are able to do is give people that are talented opportunities to do something new or try something new, or to create, because there was a famous festival in America called the Newport Jazz Festival.
Mm-hmm.
And they would have the shows done by the jazz musicians, and then afterwards they would have jams. And those would be as interesting or as compelling as the shows. And so to me, I wanted to have a way for people to be able to meet each other and create new things or do jams. The first time that TJ and Dave improvised together was at the Chicago Improv Festival. Not as a duo, but they were part of a 6-person group that I put together. Jimmy Crane was in that group. So was Kevin Dorff. So was Scott Adzik. And my apology, and Mick Naked. And then along with Pasquazi and Jagodowski. And they were the 6 of them, and they're on the main stage, and it was the closing night of one of the years of the festival. And apparently, and obviously, TJ and Dave liked each other so much from that show that they became TJ and Dave. But, I can't sit there and say, I put the 6 of them together knowing that 2 of them were going to fall in love with each other.
Yeah.
I just thought, here's 6 amazingly talented improvisers that are like great examples of, where the art form was at that point, and I wanted to be able to showcase them. And then they did their own thing. Similar, like I knew that Jill Bernard was an amazing improviser, an amazing artist. And so I don't even know why I asked her to do a solo show, just probably presuming that she had one or could do one. And because there's a period of time when I had a lot of groups from Minneapolis, and not just Jill, but some of the groups Jill was in, but then also the groups which Roy was in, and like one year we even had like 6 different groups from Minneapolis there. Mm-hmm. And later on, I gave Jill Bernard an award for the year that we honored the 50th anniversary of the Compass. We gave awards like candy. Like we were just, we thought the best way to celebrate the 50th anniversary was to give away a bunch of awards named after different people in the Compass. So we had a Spallin Award, we had a Paul Sills Award, a Dave Shepard Award, and I don't remember what I named the award for Jill outside of that. It was the Ambassador Award. Mm-hmm. And it might have been the Viola Scola Ambassador Award, but it was the Ambassador Award because to me, she was was and is such an ambassador of the art and entertainment of improv and improvisation that's why I definitely wanted to honor.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, was there were other festivals before Chicago Festival, like improv festivals dedicated to improv in
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the first improv festival that became a thing was the Kansas City Improv Festival, and that was created by Trish Farong, mm-hmm. and she produced it and ran it. She also often now does duos with Jill. And then Austin, Texas had the Big Stinking Improv Festival, which at that time was the biggest improv festival in North America. And they did it, and they also had celebrities. And part of me in front of thought, well, that's great that they have that, but Chicago ought to have a festival that reflects its status as both the birthplace of modern improvisation and that it's the Mecca and this is the place where people come. So we ought to be able to bring in celebrities, not just because of celebrities, but because of the visibility of it. And we ought to be able to eventually become the biggest improv festival. And, there were a lot of Chicago people that when CIF became the biggest improv festival in the world, were happy about that, and pride in it, because they wanted Chicago to be number one. And that's sort of what happened. There were some other festivals, but those are the 2 that I was most aware of. The Del Close Marathon started either a year or 2 after our CIF began. I don't remember enough of their history to know whether it was 1 or 2 years after we started, but then they started as well, and then they went through their path. But outside it, and then there were festivals started blossoming everywhere. And then, sort of like every improv group in every city ended up having a festival. And then somehow those, and then European festivals happen, and European improv festivals are so different than American improv festivals. Because most American improv festivals are showcasing different groups and different duos, whereas most European festivals are either an ensemble that's been put together by the festival producers, or it's people signing up to be part of workshops and then being chosen by that workshop director to be in a show. So it's almost like in some ways the focus is more on some of the individuals in Europe, and it's more groups and duos in America. And that was interesting to see the differences of it. Though I do, when I was in the Vienna Improv Festival called Moment, I was in that in 2019. They put together like 9 or 10 of us to become the ensemble for the week. Patty Stiles was part of it, and a bunch of other people that I'm sure if I started naming, you would know them.
I remember Jim Libby, I think, or Jacob, but Inbal Lori, I think. I don't know, like pretty a lot of people.
Yeah. So Jim Libby was the person who was the artistic director and invited us all to become an ensemble. And there were some people from Vienna, like 4, maybe 5, and then 5 or 6 of us, I don't remember the numbers of it, from other parts of the world. And we became a ensemble for the week. And every guest artist not from Vienna got to direct the show. So we would do 2 different acts a night, and each one was a different form or format. And then we did 6 shows over the course of the week. So that was really great because everybody that I worked with was so strong and so talented. And we did so many different forms and formats over the course of the week. It was a wonderful challenge. But that is such a different type of festival than, say, most improv festivals in America. And, the Delft Coast Marathon, I remember one of our artistic directors, who I don't want to name because they don't want to know for saying it, they often would say, yeah, but that's a marathon, not a festival. But the Delft Coast Marathon always felt like a festival to me, just called a marathon, and it happened to be running 24 hours. But, it still served the same purpose of being a festival. But yeah, before that, there were not a lot of festivals in America, which is weird to think about because there's so many festivals worldwide. Last I looked, pre-coronavirus, there were over 150 different improv festivals around the world.
Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So,
but post-virus, who knows?
Tell me, Jonathan, what was the most, exciting, memorable, greatest moment of the whole 20 years of the festival? And what was opposite of that? What was the worst one, like the most scary, difficult, afraid of moment?
The best ones are really hard to say because it's almost like each year has had its top moment. So it's hard to choose from 20 different top moments. So I would just go back to the first night when UCB performed in year 1 in front of a sold-out show and did a great show. The second year when we had Comedy Sports and Baby Wants Candy and Colin Mockery performing. The third year when we had Gratch and Faye. I also put together a Second City 40th anniversary show that had Scott Adsit and Tina Fey performing with Avery Schreiber and Mina Kolb. So 2 people from the original cast with 2 other alumni, and that was like very special. Outside of that, there were so many different memories of really great, amazing moments. On stage. Off stage, I think probably my favorite moment was because we also used to have amazing cast parties for CIF afterwards. We used to have a bar that was close to the Athenaeum, and this bar could put 200 people in there. And so in 2002, which was, of course, the year after America's 9/11, I was thinking about how can I use improvisation to show Chicago audiences that we can get past this moment. Mm-hmm. How can I sort of respond to 9/11 in the spring of 2002? And what I did was I got a improv group from Tel Aviv, Israel, to come over and be part of our festival and perform on our Saturday night. And they did 2 or 3 shows. One of the shows they did in a northern suburb where there's a lot of Jewish people that live there, so they performed that show fully in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And then they did a show on our main stage for their audience, and they did it in both English and Israeli. and they would make fun of having terrorists and having bombs and, the kind of things that we were still scared by. And they were able to show what it's like to live with that every day and how that affected their improvisation. So it really showed a different thing culturally. We also had people from the the Israeli Consulate General's office there. So we had to, that's when I started learning about what it was like to be international ambassadorship and what kind of stuff you have to do to work with the Consulate General's office for them to be there and everything. And that all was incredibly effective, because they were able to make fun of some of the things through improvisation that they lived with all the time that was still so new for us. And after the festival was over on that Sunday night, we had a big party at the bar, and one of the Israelis, improvisers, because they were getting ready to leave. They were getting ready to leave to go back to the hotel, and one of the Israeli improvisers came up and he just grabbed me and hugged me really tight, and then he pounded on his heart, and then he pounded on mine. And he was the one whose English was the least accessible. I don't want to say good, because even his worst English was so much better than my Israeli, which was non-existent. But in that moment, when he pounded on his heart and pounded on mine, I so understood what he was saying. And to be here on this street at the close of a very successful festival, surrounded by hundreds of improvisers from all over the world and all over the United States, and have somebody from Israel thank me for bringing him here, and with that gesture, showing how much it meant to him and how much it really affected his heart and how he felt a connection with me because of it. And I put a lot of work in getting the Israelis there. It took a lot of work to convince their government and to convince the American government, and it took a lot of work to get them there. And in that moment, that heart pound to heart pound, everything and all, it was 100% worth it. And so that for me is probably like one of the moments that was most moving in doing it as a human being. And then every year it would be getting, oh yeah, what are you going to say?
I wanted to say that it's even moving for me now.
Right? Yeah. And every year with once we started getting a lot of groups come, I was proud that over the 20 years we had improvisers from 27 countries come to Chicago. And if you live in Europe, that's not necessarily as big a deal because your countries are so close together. But it takes a lot of work for people to get to America. Outside of Canada and Mexico, everyone else has to work really hard to get here. So to have 27 countries represented in the 20 years of Chicago Improv Festival is one of the things I'm proud of. Yeah. And when we used to have a lot of groups performing from other countries, every year one of my favorite shows was a thing called One World on One Stage, where I would have improvisers from each country perform for 10 or 15 minutes, whatever they wanted to showcase of themselves. And then after each group did that, we took a break, and then we would have them all play together. And both the rehearsals of everyone playing together and then all playing together, either in their own language or gibberish, it was such a viola spollen moment, because here were people all around the world, and they may not share the same language, but they shared the same vocabulary of yes and it may even be said in different languages. We all still understood and shared the same work philosophies of improvisation, and it transcended cultural limitations, and it transcended vocabulary or language limitations. And it was so amazing to just see people from around the world who just met play together and playing together. It was just like this joyful energy from the rehearsal, joyful energy from the show, just this buzz. It felt like we'd overcome the Tower of Babel and found that the universal language was play. Mm-hmm. And I still believe, my lesson from that the universal language, we have several universal languages, I think, as human beings. Music is a universal language, dance is a universal language, and I think play is a universal language.
Behind you, there is a lot of tapes. Are these tapes from the festivals? These are the recordings?
Yes. I documented or had documented all 20 years of the Chicago Improv Festival.
Oh my God! So you have like a library of
Yes,
shows?
yes. I'll see if I can do this.
Oh my God! So all the shows are recorded.
Not every show, because we have so many shows, but we have recordings from every year. And it's sort of funny when you look at behind me, it starts with VHS, and then after a certain point, we don't even have it in the library anymore because they're all on external hard drives.
Yeah.
And over here, these are all CDs filled with photos from the festival, and those are the hard drives. And the festival first year started with slides and black photographs, and it's progressed to where it is. But yes, these are the Chicago Improv Festival in chronological order, and chronological order even within the shows.
Wow.
And over here, this is the chronological order of the 20 years of the festival posters. All the way over there. To year 20.
Wow.
And then, yes, you probably see the full cabinet behind me of stuff.
Yeah.
That's all those tapes. So now that I am, what I want to do with all these tapes is I've been in conversation with the Chicago Public Library main branch and also the Chicago Historical Society, is I want to donate all of these archives to one of the two organizations.
Wow.
Because I'm doing so much stuff on the road and want to continue doing stuff on the road. So I want this to have a life beyond just being here in this office. And to me, if all this archive stuff goes to either the Chicago Historical Museum or the Chicago Public Museum main library, then it has a chance to be archived and be taken care of. And, it'd be great if all of this could be digitized. Obviously, you don't have to digitize the stuff that's digitized, but it would still be nice to be able to put it somewhere. But a lot of the stuff is different forms that probably need to be digitized. And even though we're a not-for-profit organization, and I knew that we ought to get a grant to be able to do something like that, I was never able to with everything else I was doing because it was so production focused. It probably would have taken about 6 months to get a grant like that, like just focus on only that in order to get a grant for all of that. And I was just too production focused. I was always more about what's the next thing we're producing, the next show, the next festival, the next outreach that we're doing. So this way, the Chicago Public Library, Chicago Historical Museum, they have the resources to be able to digitize all of this and take care of it. And then what you have behind me is 20 years of a documentation of an art form from a Chicago and a United States and an international perspective.
Wow. That's like, I would like to see all of that.
Right? Which, if you're waiting for me to get it online, you'll never get to see it. But if one of these organizations can do it, then it'll be available for the public, and it'll be available for both public and future improvisers, anybody who might be interested in that. So I'm also talking about donating all the photos that we have and all the CDs, just the entire kit and caboodle. Because otherwise it has to live with me. And I'm very proud of the legacy of the Chicago Improv Festival, and I'm proud of the work that I did within it. But it's also an era and time period that the book is closed for me, and I've moved on to other things. I look at my teaching performing around the world as like my third act. My first act was learning how to improvise and learning how to do theater and all the stuff that I did. My second act started when I started doing the Chicago Improv Festival. My third act is what's happening now. And I really want this work behind me to be able to be accessible for other people. But I don't want to be the one to keep making it be the person to do that, because I would rather go out into the world and come back to Warsaw and do something with you and other places, and in Krakow with Alan, and all the different places around the world, than just keep taking care of this.
Absolutely.
Because again, I feel like I've done my duty. I've made my contribution.
And Thank you so much. I got to know so many interesting things. I got to know about you more, which is one of the best things which happens during all this chatting with my guests. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Monica.